Hi there, everybody. Welcome to today's AOP Live webinar. I want to thank you so much for joining us. Now, if this is the first time that you've been to an AOP Live, just a little bit about how these work. It's really all about the questions that you ask. So as we went through the registration process for today's webinar, we asked you to ask questions in advance. We did get some questions in, so we have built those into our conversation today. But also we invite you to ask questions as we're going through the conversation. You'll see a little box underneath the video where you can just pop your questions straight in there. And my colleague, Kelly Barner, who is actually off video today, is actually going to be watching for any questions as they come in. And then we'll come into some of those as we get through the conversation where it really makes sense to pose some of the questions that you're asking to our panelists. So just as a reminder is to submit a question, just use that question box below. Now, today's topic, the title of today's conversation is a critical role for procurement in mergers, acquisitions, and divestments. You know, procurement is often overlooked in mergers, acquisitions, and divestments, which really is a critical missed opportunity, or we brought along a little bit too late to really make a difference. So we're going to be talking about, you know, what role can procurement play? How can procurement get more involved in mergers, acquisitions, and divestments? And really the impact that we can have then as we do come through a deal process. My guests today, I'm going to bring them on stage in just a moment. Chris McCarney, who's a partner of consulting at KPMG, and Marcos Cortez, who's a managing director of HCLS strategy also at KPMG. So with that said, let's go into today's conversation. Hi there, Chris. Hi, Marcos. Thank you for joining me today in today's AOP Live. First, the easy question. Whereabouts are you, and I'll ask this, Marcos, to you first. Whereabouts are you joining us from today?
I am based in Orlando, Florida. That's where I'm based from.
Me too. So this is kind of a 2/3 Floridians today.
We should be doing this together next time.
Yeah, right. Chris, where are you joining us from?
I'm a bit north of you guys. I'm in the suburbs of Chicago.
Okay. Well, we will keep quiet to any conversation about weather today. My first question is, we really want to get to know both of you before we go into the conversation. Chris, this is a question that we ask all procurement practitioners and folks who have been in and around procurement for a long time is, did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
Wow. I would say it's a mutual attraction, if that makes sense. A little bit of background about myself. Prior to KPMG, I was actually in the United States Air Force.
Okay.
The role I had there was in a contracting and technology development role, and through that process, I learned a lot about, you know, how do you engage a third party, highly regulated environment. How do we create these massive agreements? But more importantly, I would say that I learned, you know, the power of the supply base, right? So in that role, we were developing products, you know, that were helping us, you know, fight wars, right? That you know, that the U.S. Air Force and other services were using. And through that process, I saw the power of the supply base. And then when I came to KPMG and I made the transition to consulting, I would say I always found myself working with the input end of organizations, and more, you know, whether you call it supply chain or purchasing, you know, helping our clients either evolve the procurement function, work closer with their suppliers, and you know, in a variety of fashions. And so again, I would say it's a mutual attraction. And to where today, one of my roles in the consulting business is to oversee that strategic procurement capability set for the firm. And as I said, I consider myself a procurement as my major and M&A as my minor.
Which is a good setup, I think, for the conversation that we're going to have today about procurement's role in M&A. And before we go that much further, Marcos, I'm going to bring you into the conversation too. And your background isn't necessarily procurement. So I wonder if you could, like, how do you best describe your role to a procurement audience?
Yeah, just to give a little introduction about myself. As you said, I'm a managing director within our M&A transaction execution center of excellence. And I've been working as a consultant since 1992. I started as a technology consultant, and I migrated to M&A in about 12 years ago. spanning, several industries from life science to technology and energy companies. At KPMG, I'm dedicated to support global clients and supporting the inorganic growth strategies, managing primarily initiatives in mergers, acquisitions, carve-out, due diligence, throughout, let's say, post-close activities.
Right.
And really focus on advising clients, establishing, their project infrastructure, kind of help them with their, either separation, integration strategy, planning for day one, implementing transition services agreements, and really leading more tactically than pre and post merger activities.
Okay.
Prior to KPMG, I worked at Siemens in the M&A Corp Dev team, where I was responsible to manage a portfolio of integration and separation management activities.
Well, I'm looking forward to kind of digging into the role that procurement can play as well, and what you see kind of as a little bit of an outsider to procurement. I'm sure there are things that you've seen where we can really up our game to make sure that we have as big an impact as we possibly can for our organizations within mergers, divestments, and acquisitions. Now, to kick things off, we actually just ran a little bit of a LinkedIn poll leading up to today's webinar, where we asked our community, what is your experience with mergers, divestitures, and acquisitions? We wanted to get a little bit of a pulse check on the audience. So if we could just bring up the slide here with the results. So what is your experience with mergers, divestitures, and acquisitions? And so the results that we had about 100 responses. 65% said that they'd been there and done that. 15% said, yes, my organization did, but procurement wasn't involved. 15% said they had no experience with any, and 5% are going through a merger or acquisition right now. And so, Chris, I want to ask, is that consistent with what you see?
It is. I think when I worked on my first separation, the client I was working with at the time, it was a very foreign concept. This hey, what am I doing inside of a deal? And this one again happened to be a separation when the client was selling two major assets, two major pieces of their business, and it was a very foreign concept to the procurement and supply chain organization. I think today, we see a lot more experience in this space. But it's usually one event or two events, right? So for us procurement professionals to having to go through this one or two times in your career is normal. But for someone like Marcos or somebody who's in a corporate development team, that you're doing this constantly. So a lot of people are exposed to it, see a lot of experience with it. But I think the real question is kind of the depth of experience and involvement.
Right. It was interesting from this and this kind of goes with my experience as well, that at some point in time during a procurement leader's career, they're going to go through a merger, acquisition, or divestiture. Only 15% say that they haven't done so far. I can speak from my experience as we go into the conversation. I've been through two, both divestitures of divisions within larger organizations, where I went with the divested organization. And so you're really starting kind of a procurement function from scratch, as you land within the new organization that is spun out of a larger one. So I think for anyone who is in procurement that hasn't been through one of these, you likely will be going through one at some point. I have one of the interesting things is you see that second top result, and I'm going to come to you, Marcos, on this. Yes, but procurement wasn't involved is 15% of responses. And is that why is it that procurement sometimes doesn't get involved in the M&A process?
Yeah, but primarily because mainly the deal team focus on getting the transaction done. And in many times, operational topics could be a distraction if not managed appropriately. To that, I always recommend typically for the procurement stakeholders to be in the room during the diligence activities, not being at the table, to allow the organization not only to think more strategically, but allow the deal team to perform, let's say, the transaction activities with no major distractions.
So there's a risk of trying to become too involved. Is that fair? Or being seen by the deal team as a distraction versus
There's always, there is always that, let's say, handoff points, right?
Mhm.
Which typically, exist. They typically happen during the due diligence to the deal closing and readiness, phase. But you need to find what's the good balance of that handoff. Let's say more mature organizations, more deal making mature organizations done this and have like the muscle memory to do this very seamless. And organizations that either may not have a corp dev team that is very mature and very dedicated process that is widely known within the organization have a tendency to avoid, involvement of operational related stakeholders to really not to distract the deal making activities.
Right.
So, yeah, I'd offer that the maturity level, really there's a really large spectrum here. We have some clients, they may be listening in or watching it today. I can think of one.
Got to be careful, right?
I can think of one large client of ours that has a dedicated acquisitions and divestiture team. And they really, not just for procurement, but for all functions, they have dedicated professionals ready to go because they're so involved in acquisitions and divestments, right? They're constantly buying, selling, spinning, whatnot. And in that case, they have dedicated teams. In many cases, as you said, if you haven't gone through one, you will go through one. And, where we spend a lot of our time is helping our clients prepare, right? Because this is the first time they're going through it. So it's a pretty wide range, but I'd offer that it's a little bit of the plight of the procurement professional, like as always, like we're always trying to demonstrate our value.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a lot of why procurement isn't involved. It's just kind of this constant quest to demonstrate our value to the organization, whether that's, candidly inside of a deal cycle or outside of one.
Yeah. I know we're going to get into some specifics, but I wanted to follow up, can we be too needy as procurement professionals when you find yourself in the room and that actually plays to our detriment?
Yeah, that's really a great observation. We can be, right? And we, procurement professionals tend to want to get into the data, ask a lot of questions. We don't do well with assumptions. And so to find yourself in a diligence process with limited information and trying to either execute on or establish a proper investment or deal thesis, whatever the case may be. I think procurement professionals, if we're not careful, can kind of get in the way. Yeah. I think the trick there, though, is understanding and being able to speak acquisitions and divestitures, right? I think that's kind of the first stage of demonstrating value is understanding the language, understanding let's be empathetic to, if you will, to those corporate development folks that are really trying to get the deal done, and really pick and choose the right questions to ask. Yeah. And the right information to do.
And I think adding to that is start having a good appreciation of the strategic rationale for that inorganic activity. It's key to really find that proper balance, because the procurement related activities could be high on the top of, let's say, the synergy list, or it could be something that needs to happen to ensure that you have certainty in terms of value preservation. And kind of have a good appreciation about the strategic components, the strategic rationale of that initiative is super important to allow the procurement stakeholders to say, okay, should I ask this question now? Or is this something that I will park mainly for the integration planning phase or integration execution phase? If it is an investment, might be a more tactical related component that can be addressed, at the later stages of the deal.
And I imagine that a lot of information at that, certainly in early stages of a deal cycle, is on a need to know basis. So, it might not be, the organization may not be wanting to divulge broadly when there are some sensitive plans. And so those that, are involved in those conversations, perhaps, there's a confidentiality requirement.
Yeah. I'll give an example as an M&A professional. A lot of my live projects that I'm working with clients on deals that has not been assigned, I have not even, because I'm really focused on a piece of the deal that, as I say, focus more on the execution. And there are information such as the valuation that I don't need to know, right? And I simply don't ask. I'm very comfortable. You become comfortable to operate on the environment that you have little to no information, right? And I think this is something that, typically more seasoned, let's say, deal professionals have a certain level of comfortability to operate in that environment.
Well, yeah, I think this is where the procurement professional and the M&A professional, there's a little bit of how do we meet in the middle here, right?
Yeah.
We can kick and scream and kind of want to be in the room and be in the middle of the deal. Probably won't get that far upstream in the deal cycle. Obviously, the earlier the better, but at the same time, through education, I think we want procurement to kind of, be maybe not top of mind, but be consideration, right? And I think the ability again to meet in the middle will really extract a lot of value in the deal cycle. I mean, I can't tell you how many times, we've been part of this where, especially in acquisition environment, diligence is done, right, by a consulting team somewhere. They get to signing, they do the deal, and they're getting to closing, and they've got all these synergy targets, and it's way too late in the process. The chief procurement officer, heads of supply chain, gets handed a synergy target, and it's a significant portion of the overall deal value. Again, maybe it's the plight of procurement again. We're always kind of the last ones to be considered, but I think it's earlier recognition of procurement's role, whether it's synergies, dyssynergies. But to Marcos's point, I think sometimes there are real items in a purchase sale agreement that tie to procurement activities in order to close the deal that we find out too late about. But the earlier we can get that information, I think the better prepared we're going to be, for day one and beyond.
So I'm already seeing some questions coming in. I actually want to go a little bit deeper into the role of procurement within the deal cycle in a moment, which is actually a great segue, Marcos. If you could share a little bit for us that aren't necessarily involved in M&A every single day of the week, what does a deal cycle look like? What's kind of the process of an M&A deal?
Yeah, that is a great question. And it always starts with, say, the M&A strategy, right? Which is basically, it's part of the phase where the deal team is really looking for assets. It's kind of M&A strategy and target screening, which is basically they're looking for assets, and the focus is really to identify assets that will basically fulfill the strategic rationale of the growth strategy of that organization. Really, the second step is the due diligence, in which on an acquisition, if we focus on acquisition, the main aspect is to validate the historical financial performance and confirm the strategic rationale. Essentially, this is the step that validates the target attractiveness for, let's say, in this case, the acquisition in question. Kind of the third step that's really we get closer to, like, the handoff point is the deal readiness and close. And now kind of between the second step that I just mentioned, the due diligence, and this one is where the handoff occurs. And it's where the deal team is kind of turning the operational components of the execution to the business. And there are three main points that typically we see that risk areas of concerns. Number one, resources fail to recognize and understand the key value of the opportunities, let's say in form of synergies. Two, integration resources are not involved early enough, which makes it challenging for the procurement teams to prepare, let's say, the execution piece or prepare a strategy for execution. And three is an effectiveness on knowledge transfer, because in many times the deal team already, get that deal done. They're really focused on the next one, and they just want to pass the baton as quickly as possible. And they have a tendency to rush and pass the information and kind of turn over this to the business-oriented stakeholders.
So as we look about that deal cycle, and Chris, maybe I'll pose this follow-up to you. What should we as procurement professionals aspire? Like, where should we aspire to be involved? Should we be, because when Marcos goes through that, I'm thinking, you know what? If we're really, 10xing the impact of our procurement organization, we're involved in deal strategy, because we're seeing all supply markets and opportunities perhaps for integration by looking at and bringing targets to the table. But is that an unrealistic goal? Should we kind of lower our sights for how and when is the right time for procurement to get involved?
No, don't lower your side. I think we've got to push as hard as we can, as we draw this, as we lay the deal cycle out on the page, right? I always say we got to get to the left-hand side of that page, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're always on the right-hand side, it seems like. And I think our ability to swim upstream in that deal cycle, and I wouldn't say influence it, but be a consideration starting at that kind of strategy level and into diligence. The more we can be considered, the more procurement can be thought about. I truly believe, there's greater value in that deal, right? Ability to execute. It only takes a few kind of questions to ask in diligence to ultimately have downstream impacts.
And if I may add to that is, when I mean, like, say, the procurement team needs to be in the room, I mean, I'm going to throw something out there. It's like, it's not necessarily physically in the room, and also not using like some form of, I was thinking even about the metaverse and anything like that. I think it's all about data and technology, because I think we need to find a better balance for procurement organizations to mature the contract lifecycle management activities to allow better access to contract data, spend data, and have that information readily available even before the deals comes to the table. Because I think, to me, more mature organizations from the contract lifecycle management perspective have the ability to have that information readily available for deal teams to really do a proper diligence. And to me, if you want to really to be on that further, left of the page, as Chris alluded to, which I love it, is not necessarily has to be physically, but the procurement needs to be represented. And I think the best way of doing this is with data and technology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Marcos. I mean, our clients that even without a deal are digitally enabled across their procurement function are so much more effective in acquisitions and divestitures. I do think that for organizations that are considering some sort of digital transformation of their procurement function, and they're acquisitive or they're active in M&A, assets spinning off, being acquired. I just think that is such an important part of any business cases. If you're considering doing a deal, there's a ton of value in digitally enabling and digitally transforming your procurement function.
Yeah, because we've seen that, let's say, M&A professionals have a tendency to be, they know how to understand data. And the main thing, if you, let's pick an example, let's say the synergy aspect. And cost synergy is always an important component in any transaction. Buy side and sell side, there's always a thing, behind on costs. On the sell side, you more focus on preserving value. And on the buy side, is really, capture and improving value. But the main point is having that level of maturity on your digital strategy within the procurement organization. It will allow you to be in the room more effectively, because you fight with the organization. I think it's very difficult to counter arguments, confidentiality provisions, the concerns that the C-level executives have in terms of having a small group of stakeholders managing the deal on early phases. And I think the best way to augment these on influence organizations is with that technology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, Marcos, I remember we worked on a deal with a large life sciences organization, basically split the company in half and did a spinoff. And I remember separations also, by the way, I find to be much more complicated for procurement than integrations. Yeah. So we were sending half of the enterprise, to go spin off and rebrand themselves. And we were shipping contracts to our offshore team to do the analysis, to do pull out the terms, what contracts could we assign, what could we not. And that was a manual process that we were cranking through spreadsheets to, recent deals where, our client's ability to run a report and have all that contract information or have all that metadata readily available. What that does from a synergy or dyssynergy analysis perspective, what that allows you to profile from a risk perspective, it's really powerful stuff. And again, our clients didn't wait till the deal was happening to put that capability in place, right? That has to happen, well in advance of the deal happening.
Now, Chris, making me feel like a dinosaur, because now I see a lot of our consultants, they're using those AI technologies. It's like video game. It works like magic, right? And it is fantastic how we augmented from that deal that Chris is using an example from now, that we leverage technology to accelerate those activities on a tremendous pace. The amount of information that we can handle now, leverage technology, and really allow, for example, the more, let's say, more seasoned professionals in the procurement organization, us to be more strategic. Because I think, Chris, you remember we spent a lot of times doing nitty-gritty work that we could expanding more, on the strategic part, of the transition, right? And I think technology, perhaps in post-pandemic environment, and technology that acceleratable points that allow us to be more strategic. But I think we need to use more, not less of technology. And I agree with you. It does require capital investments, but I think especially on this economic cycle where, the supply chain disruption is going from buyers to sellers, I think this is well money spent, to get access to the data that you have at your disposal.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. If you look at in today's world and what we're seeing with what I would call kind of supply risk as well as supplier risk, this notion in most deal environments, there's this notion of kind of transitioning, safe, compliant, ongoing operations, right? Yep. That transition, whether it's inbound or outbound, and taking the supply base through that is more critical today than it ever has been before. And it's everything from how do you identify and act on certain agreements with certain suppliers, but it's kind of holding suppliers' hands through the process, as well as internal stakeholders, right? Where's my supplier? Where's my stuff? Yeah. It's really kind of a sensitive space today, given where what many organizations supply bases are in a squeeze, if you will.
Well, we've got a lot of great questions. I think it's really interesting that you said to tie in an organization that's active in the market, to tie procurement transformation investment from an ROI perspective to the success of acquisitions, divestitures, mergers, because you've got the speed. I'm sure that having confidence in numbers drives greater confidence in the synergies, which can drive deal price. So there's lots of reasons and ways that data is critical, not just beyond doing good procurement, but actually to the outcomes of the process itself. And I just want to pick a couple of questions that we got in as we're speaking here. The first one is from Monica. What questions should procurement ask during due diligence? As you're kind of going through that, I think pre-close process. Chris, I'll pose that one to you first.
Yeah, I think the biggest questions for me, there's really kind of two components of this. One is the supply base, right? So I think there's some basic questions in due diligence around what are the critical sources of supply? Obviously, who are the major suppliers? How do we get at that? What is going to ensure supply continuity? And also like what's going to maintain the appropriate cost base as well. And there's some questions there, like what's critical to this organization, and who are the suppliers that are tied to that criticality. The other piece of this is in the function of procurement itself. I think there's always some questions to be asked of who's doing it, the purchasing, what does the organization look like, what's the degree of centralization? Because quickly you're going to need to start processing, how that function is going to transition and what it's going to look like in the future. Those are kind of the two forms that I think you typically want to get at as early as possible. The functional domain itself, and then there's the supply base aspect of it.
I have a question from David. I'm going to ask this to you, Marcos. What regulatory rules impact what information can be exchanged during M&As that procurement needs to be familiar with? And not necessarily these are the rules, but these are the principles. Like, what do we need to be careful of?
Yeah, from the regulatory standpoint, it's also, let's say, a little bit of there's an industry component that plays a factor, right? But on a nutshell, let's say one of the regulatory aspects that will come to fruition in any deal is the antitrust aspect, and it's how much information it can share pre-close, right? And that, I think, typically is, not widely considered in many cases, but that's something that, you need to have some basic understanding if, that particular transaction is under, the formal term appears to be a little intimidating as under investigation, but it's under verification from the Federal Trade Commission. But having understanding how information can be shared during the M&A life cycle and how you can plan to during the different phases is an important component of the execution.
Yeah, I remember one of the first deals I did early in my consulting career. It was an oil and gas deal. They were selling two very large refineries as well as some other assets. And they got the whole transaction team together and they took us through gun jumping training. Like, you can't jump the gun.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's all these HSR, there's all these regulations out there, where there's only so much information you can exchange with each party. And typically the amount of exchange increases as you get closer to close, right? So early days, one side doesn't want to share everything with the other side. People are putting ring fences, but as you get closer to the deal, the information exchange really, starts to flow.
Yeah. You may use, like, say, a clean team to evaluate say such information to allow you to have access to strategic information to finalize the M&A, the strategic planning. But this is something that, as Chris mentioned, it's super important that you have some form of basic knowledge that's associated with your industry, domain.
Yeah.
We have a couple of questions kind of on the same theme, and it's around about objections for procurement's involvement in the M&A process. And so one that we got actually in advance was from Mark. Mark says our M&A team uses the excuse of secrecy with regards to leaving procurement out of the activities. What has been the most successful argument against the claim that secrecy cannot be maintained? Chris, you look like you've had some experience of that in the past.
And it just goes, it kind of, I feel like, again, as poor procurement professionals, I get this image of my head of like the kid trying to look over the huddle, like, let me in there, what's going on? Let me in the deal. Every deal is a snowflake, as we say, right? There are unique aspects to every deal. And are there things that need to be held confidential? Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. There's typically going to be a degree of secrecy. But again, that doesn't mean procurement needs to be completely uninformed. What it does mean is, even if I am not in the circle, right? How do I arm, again, those deal teams with the information before they're even considering the deal, right? And so secrecy should not be an excuse, right? And so, there's a theme I keep coming back to is as much preparation as you can do and education you could do between your deal teams and your procurement teams in advance, the secrecy is not going to be an issue.
Yeah.
Because the deal team's asking the right questions on your behalf.
It's almost feels like if you're being asked to get involved, when you're already down the process of the deal cycle, it's already too late. It's that proactiveness in advance, and the organization recognizing that there's a value that procurement can bring to the table and there's data that procurement has. If you haven't done all that, the upfront work that's not necessarily related to a merger or an acquisition, that perception leads to how involved you get and perhaps where the excuses and the objections come from as the process gets more serious.
Right.
I mean, we learn, and I think in many of the transactions that I participated is procurement, becomes an afterthought, by the deal team. And I'm going to go back that if you can counter that, say, political, say, dynamic within your organization focus in creating a level of maturity within the procurement organization by, have data available for the deal team, because you're going to influence the deal in a more positive aspect, because the deal team will have access to key information that historically they may not have access. They had to make up, a bunch of assumptions. And if they have access to that information, necessarily they're going to have questions, and then you're going to invite procurement stakeholders to be in the room.
Yeah.
That means really you have to influence and be comfortable in have a level of maturity that your organization is present, but perhaps not physically initially, but you have a good representation, because I'm going to continue to use the example of contract lifecycle management, activities is well established, operating on top quartile, that, the DTM has pure access to contract level data, spend level data, that they can properly forecast, for example, synergies.
I think, sometimes, this isn't a question of, being involved for the sake of being involved, right?
Yeah.
This is not, let's kind of check our egos, right? Some people just, it's not about being left out. It is about, once you do learn about it, looking at the expectations and go, wait, who did this, right? Who did this diligence? Where did they come up with that number? Wait, I have to be able to transition how many agreements in what period of time?
Yeah.
And I think as a procurement professional, being engaged and being notified of a transaction and the terms of it and whatnot, and knowing that the deal team actually asks these questions on your behalf is just that's getting off on the right foot, right? As opposed to, we didn't ask any of these questions, we better go ask. That's now you're on the back foot, as they say.
And
right?
we put a placeholder in the synergies, and now you're on the hook. I've been through that process before. A number is then given to the street for you to deliver on, and that number may not lay much bearing on reality, but because you weren't involved in that process, it sticks, and then that's for procurement then to deliver on.
Yeah, we had a transaction. We were supporting the procurement and supply chain organization, and there were terms in the purchase sale agreement that had to be met, and certain schedules had to be populated at the time of closing. So they came to us extremely late in the process. We didn't have knowledge of this requirement, but we had to report all the open purchase orders over a certain materiality, and so we're scrambling with, weeks to go before close. How are we going to populate this schedule? And this is actually a combination of technology issues, knowledge issues that we talked about already, but the ability to simply run an open PO report and have it ready to go on the day of close. And we wound up kind of doing that exercise, that dress rehearsal for weeks in order to make sure we had that process done right. If we had known about that requirement, when we first started the process, it would have been much easier. Instead, you find yourself scrambling, working through disparate systems, trying to understand the requirement in detail, right? And that's at the final hour. Not to say you're always scrambling at the final hour on these things, but the earlier the better.
And I just have a question that came in from Grant. Grant said, "This is a great conversation. Will it be rebroadcast so we can watch and listen again?" I just want to let you know, Grant, that this will be available to watch on demand afterwards if you'd like to share with any colleagues to get more folks to watch it. So yes, Grant is the answer to that question. Now there's a bunch of questions still on objections, and I know that I don't want to spend the entire webinar on objections as much as I could, and the answers would be really interesting. But I want to pivot a little bit towards procurement itself, the integration of procurement. I've seen these deals that happen, and one of two things typically happen, or at least in the experience that I've had, one of two things has happened. One is that there's a divestiture that's left a procurement organization to be built from the ground up, or it's a merger and there's two competing procurement organizations, and it's like going through the pre-merger stage. You have two competing to show I can bring more value to the combined organization than somebody else. One of the questions that we had was from Craig, and so I'll ask this to you, Chris. What are your views on the downstream integration processes with existing process and tech infrastructure? So once you're looking at a deal closed, how do you start bringing everything together?
Yeah, so Bill, you mentioned the scenario where you have to go build a net new procurement function. That's fun.
Right.
That's fun, right? There are boundaries. It's not a blank check, but that's fun.
You have to go and beg all your suppliers to give you the same deal that you gave them. That they gave you when you have a bigger.
In a different scenario nowadays, right?
The integration process, though, to answer Craig's question, the integration process, like every corporate function, like every what I would call back office function, it can be a challenge, right? And this is where you see kind of the classic culture clash. The question over, are there synergies in people, right? That these are headcount synergies, are real synergies that get looked after in these environments. You got competing systems, you got highly centralized versus decentralized, and so we are at the same time, you don't have a blank checkbook. So the question becomes very often is, if there's not a dominant buyer, if there's not a dominant kind of player that says, hey, we're gonna integrate you're coming our way. Yeah. You do find yourself oftentimes from a process and technology and infrastructure perspective, picking off what you want to keep and what you want to go. That's hard, right? There's kind of no easy way around it. But what I'd offer is that whether it's the enterprise at large or procurement in itself, it's a massive opportunity to upgrade capability. That's where, again, it's not easy, but to take a deal environment and say, hey, I can take the best of what I'm getting. I can shed poor process. I can refresh my tech stack, right? I think that's critical. That's a huge opportunity for the function, because I think most of us procurement professionals on the line know you don't get an opportunity very often to invest in your capabilities, to refresh your tech stack, to redo process. But what also is very difficult, and that's in these deals, is the knowledge transfer. Category teams, spend careers dialing in a category strategy, working with their supply base, and so in a lot of these integrations or separations, for that matter, that knowledge transfer is really a critical component to making integration successful. Yeah,
and adding to that, it's always gets back to the point to say how early procurement teams are involved in the deal. If you're not involved early enough, then you can influence the investment on those initiatives. It becomes very difficult, because we see many deals that there was no thought process into to kind of integrate processes in the technology infrastructure, and that becomes part of, let's say, the business improvement activities, which with very tight budgets, and especially on the North American market, it becomes very challenged because it's very competitive. It's all about, let's say, cost efficiency and cost, effectiveness in terms of your profile. Becomes very effective. That's why it gets back how early procurement teams are involved in the deal, that they can influence those initiatives in a more strategic fashion.
So you're, as a procurement leader in this situation, you're needing to also make the case for the investment as part of the integration budget. So you're fighting for dollars from an integration budget, but you're doing that as the deal is being solutioned, because the finances are based on a lot of the implementation integration budgets, as opposed to waiting for the deal to close and being told, okay, you've got this pot of money, go and integrate the two teams.
Right. If you focus on the ROI, you'll say those investments are going to not only help realization of synergies, but also going to improve by this, and that. That becomes a more, let's say, easier path to make a case for investments, right? But it comes down to, like, say, the early phases of the diligence, being able to really identify those gaps and ensure that they're properly not only forecasted, but accounted, to ensure that you have the financial resources and the human capital also to execute. And I think that's, like the morning exercise, I think there's a lot of capital available, but we are fighting for resources. Technology is being very difficult to get integrated nowadays.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons a function's overlooked is because it's so tangible, right? And everybody knows procurement. It's procurement. Everybody knows procurement. But I think how tangible it is. It's one of the corporate functions where you can sit there and go, for every dollar I invest, I should be able to see what I'm getting back out, right? There's a real kind of return on procurement investment. I think one of the classic issues that we see in integration is as you bring in two organizations together and you've got a synergy target to hit, but you've also got a headcount, you've got what I call third-party spend synergy target to hit, and then you've got a headcount target to hit. The expectation is that you're bringing down the headcount, but yet you need those resources to deliver on the synergy savings. So it becomes this debate that says how many variable resources do I need over what period of time to really go capture the synergies? And so the profile of the organization does start to look different than the other functions that they're expecting synergies out of. And so it becomes a very tricky debate for procurement to say, hey, I have this extra load of work that I need to keep these resources around in order to go execute.
So it's not unusual to kind of invest up front, capture the value that is part of the business case, but then you're always kind of looking at steady state and what steady state is and how that may look different from what you need up front. Let's see, where I have a few questions and what I was going to ask that slipped from my mind. So I'm going to see what I have on here to go. So this is a great question. What about mergers and acquisitions where the culture, as it relates to spend governance, is very different between the two organizations? One that's very cost conscious. Maybe the other one is, well, it's all around collaboration and partnership.
Yeah, I think culture is something that can't be overlooked. And I think this goes with any with any function that goes through the integration process. We had a life sciences client that purchased they were a development, product development company, and culturally, this large life sciences conglomerate their procurement function is so dialed in. They are a machine, right? And you buy this company that is they're researchers, right? That's in their culture, and margins are huge, right? And you're bringing this procurement function, let alone the supply base, into an environment where we run a tight ship, right? And we're constantly asking suppliers to sharpen their pencils. We're asking our teams to run lean, and so the procurement professionals from the acquired organization was a little bit of a culture shock. I mean, everything from how do we communicate to our suppliers, how stringent are our agreements, everything's done on our paper, not supplier's paper, to here are the systems and processes that we use, and thou shall cut a purchase order for every agreement. To that acquired organization, that's a shock. Right. Oh, by the way, I have to do the supplier enablement as well to bring that supply base along. And so that's a very, very difficult thing. And what I would say is this kind of goes to the heart in many cases of the communications and change management. I mean, we can talk about process and infrastructure and technology required, but the communication and change management that's required, not only to the procurement professionals, but to the supply base as well, is critical in these environments.
Yeah, I did a recent deal between, let's say, a large public institution and a biologic research center that had fundamentally not only, let's say, different cultures in terms of spending, let's say, strategy and activities, but it's also to their operations. And the whole conclusion that came from the deal team and the acquirer, which was this large public university, was we need to preserve the operational components of their procurement, say, activities and the way they do things to ensure researchers will stay with us.
Right.
Grants, they continue to obtain grants. They'll continue to obtain new faculty to their, medical doctor, program. That means that expands to all facets of the organization, right? That is also very important to have, let's say, human capital professionals that understand and have the sensibility to really look at, data very differently and the impact, right? Because something that may be rational to execute it from the procurement standpoint could it be an absolute, let's say, disaster, for the rest of the organization, because it's going to influence not only how they do business, employee satisfaction, how they impact their customers, and etc.
Marcos, how about, and sorry if I'm telling too many war stories, but how about the deal? Marcos and I worked on a deal pre-pandemic. We were elbow to elbow, working hard with our teams. We were on the sell side, right, of a deal that was being contemplated. I recall the potential buyer, once they saw the cultural difference and the operational differences of the company that we were trying to sell, the potential buyer started to raise an eyebrow and say, well, I'm not sure we want to do this anymore. So these culture clashes, right? It really, it's not just like culture, behavior, attitude. It comes out in the operations of the business. It comes out in the operation of the function, the procurement function. So Marcos and I working with a client trying to help them sell the business. Yeah, and the buyer's going, wait a second, I don't think I want to do this deal now that I'm seeing what I'm seeing.
And this was an example based.
Sorry, Marcos.
Yeah, this was an example that our client, the seller, had an approach to certain facets of the procurement organization that was more relationship based oriented. How to manage, their supplier bases. And the buyer was mainly more transaction oriented. And they couldn't understand why do I need a relationship manager for those key third-party accounts to manage this relationship? They couldn't understand the value, right? But it's kind of fascinating how culture can influence, the performance of the organization from the procurement standpoint.
We had a great question from Dave that came in advance. What mistakes, if any, have you seen procurement teams make during this process, and how can we avoid them? And I'm sure that could probably be the subject of another whole webinar. And I know we've touched on a couple of them throughout the conversation, but Chris, anything that kind of immediately comes to mind as things that you see and you just think, let's take a step back a minute.
I think the big one is don't assume your suppliers are just going to get in line. I think you see that obviously.
It's more evident now,
Yeah. Don't assume when you say jump, they're going to say how high. I think that's a pretty poor assumption. And I think the other thing is, sometimes procurement organizations think they're operating better than they are. Oh, we've got our contracts in order. Yep. Oh, we've got that data at our fingertips. And so I think those are some of the mistakes. It's really more assuming, over assuming you can get things done in a period of time. You have access to information. And again, I come back to the suppliers are just going to do that bidding. I think that's a pretty big mistake.
Marcos, what do you see as an outsider?
Yeah, I think just adding what Chris just mentioned, I think and act strategic, because historically, I observe the many procurement organizations, especially in the deal space, have a tendency to focus primarily, say, contract transitions, open POs transition, and not thinking strategic enough to capture and improve value of the deal, right? And you can get very easily really tied up with those activities and kind of thinking of the big picture.
Yeah, all about the outcomes. We talk so much on Art of Procurement about driving business outcomes. It's not about our procurement goals necessarily. It's about how do we connect with what the business needs. And it sounds like it's no different from an M&A perspective. Now, we've got a couple of minutes left. If anybody does have any last questions, please send them over. We may get a chance to ask one more. But I have a very tactical question for you, Chris. And it kind of ties on what we just talked about before, but I also referenced it in my experience before of suppliers and working with suppliers. You go through the transaction and then suppliers are coming back to the table and saying, well, now you're a different business. There's change of command language in my contract. I want to put everything on the table again and renegotiate this. Any advice on how to respond if you start to get a flurry of those once the deal is closed?
Yeah, I don't know if we have enough time to really get. So there are a variety of kind of tactics and techniques. What we do find is suppliers. I always say suppliers do want to continue to supply.
Yeah.
Right. If a supplier is approaching this environment going, hey, it's time to renegotiate, it's probably because the deal wasn't balanced the right way in the first place, right? It's probably not. They're just, they're coming to squeeze you because they have an opportunity to. I've seen that. Like, hey, somebody put this is a raw deal. This is a bad deal, Yeah. And that's typically what's happening. Now, there are some things like when we see technology agreements that, suppliers want to, establish themselves with the new organization. One of the tips that I would give, especially when there's any sort of separation, it's really an opportunity for a supplier to do business, to establish a new account, to do new business and grow with a new organization. And that's typically where we advise clients. Try not to give away too many of the tricks, but that's a big one. I mean, suppliers want to supply. It's typically an opportunity for them to grow their business. And what's really important, and this is a very tactical thing, suppliers want to know how they're getting paid on day one. Yeah. So your ability to kind of communicate like P2P and where do you send your invoice and cash flow continuity is going to help that supplier kind of come through the transition a lot easier.
Marcos, do you see in a deal, will there be a contingency typically made for risk associated with suppliers coming back and asking for increased pricing, for example, because you're dealing with now, for example, if it's a divested organization, a smaller business?
Yeah, you typically have, let's say, have, let's say, critical suppliers, being early on being identified, because so relationships that have to be communicated in advance to ensure they have the time to probably negotiate contracts that we typically say there's require a white glove treatment. But the answer to your question is yes, Phil. I say we typically identify critical suppliers to ensure that we take a very strategic, approach to communicate about the deal and also facilitate the negotiation. And it really depends if you're doing an integration or separations. The basically, like say, the dynamics are very different, right?
We spend a lot of time, Phil, on it's actually very similar to the way we do supplier enablement for technology deployments. We spend a lot of time tiering the suppliers. So if you think about kind of critical, strategic, and other, that critical tier is going to get some white glove treatment. There's no way around it. And then how you treat those suppliers in the lower tiers will vary and will change. But also don't make the mistake that the most amount of spend makes them the most important supplier. I always say, if you forget to bring that inspection or certification supplier through the process and you forget about them, you can be in a world.
In pharma, it's typically the lab services. They look and spend might be like 10, 15,000, but if you miss, like an inspection, you might get dinged by the FDA.
Yeah, or you mess with somebody's lab supplies and all of a sudden you've got mutiny from all your scientists.
Yeah.
Well, I know it's about time to wrap up. Marcos, Chris, I want to thank you so much for joining us on AOP Live today. I want to thank everybody in the audience for submitting all the questions. As always, we got a lot more questions than we answer in the time we had, but I think you've really kind of unlocked what it looks like to be inside a merger and acquisition, and such importance, as we talked about really throughout the entire conversation, of it's not necessarily about what you do when you're in the room or when you're around the room when a deal is happening, but what can you do in advance? How can you make sure that your best, so that your organization looks as you as a procurement function as somebody who can bring value to a deal, as opposed to, we'll kind of set some numbers as we go through the business case and then push it down on procurement when the deal is closed.
Yeah. Exactly.
So, all right. Well, with that, let's wrap up. Marcos, Chris, one last time, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. It was fun.
Thank you.
Take care.